I've seen political disasters for decades, but this one rewrites the rule book. Nobody expected this. A country that was supposed to cave, was supposed to beg for mercy, just delivered one of the most brutal economic counterpunches modern trade has ever seen. And the fallout? It's hitting the very industries that funded this disaster in the first place. If you want the real story behind economic power, political decisions, and who actually pays the price. Subscribe now and drop your location in the comments. If this helped you understand what's really going on, like and share it, because more people need to see this. I'm Robert Reich, UC Berkeley professor, and for decades I've studied how power and money shape democracy. Let me explain what's happening, who wins, who loses, and why. This story begins with arrogance and ends with consequences. Because on Christmas Day, Donald Trump picked a fight no one expected. He went after Greenland, he went after Panama, and most importantly, he went after Canada. He essentially told Canadians to go to hell, floated the absurd idea that Canada should become the 51st state, and openly threatened their sovereignty, their economy, and their national identity. Then came the real shock. Total silence from the Republican establishment. Not a word from Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader from Kentucky, even as his own state's signature industry was about to get hammered. No condemnation, no pushback, not even an acknowledgement that threatening one of America's largest trading partners during the holiday season might be a disastrous strategic move. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Donald Trump fundamentally does not understand how people work. He operates on the delusion that bullying, threats, and intimidation somehow produce respect or cooperation. The logic of a schoolyard bully who's shocked when no one shows up to his birthday party. You can't threaten people into friendship, and you can't strong-arm entire nations into better trade deals. Eventually, and this is what he has never understood, people push back and they organize. They find alternatives, and that's exactly what Canada did. Furious at being treated like a vassal state, Canadians launched what's being described as the largest consumer boycott in living memory. No government orders, no new laws, no formal trade barriers, just millions of people deciding on their own to stop buying American products. And here's where Trump's failure to think even a few moves ahead becomes obvious. This boycott wasn't random. It was deliberate, targeted, and strategic, aimed squarely at U.S. industries that had long backed Republican candidates and Trump himself. The bourbon and wine industries, sectors that poured millions into Republican campaigns, suddenly found themselves staring down an existential crisis, and this was no accident. It was a calculated response meant to make Trump's enablers feel the cost of their choices. The fallout has been brutal. Kentucky's $9 billion bourbon industry is in freefall, and Jim Beam, one of the most iconic names in American spirits, is shutting down its main distillery for all of next year, a facility that's been running continuously since 1935. 1,500 unionized workers are now left in limbo, all to satisfy Donald Trump's ego. And the industry's excuses? Almost farcical, claiming the shutdown is about site enhancements as the damage becomes impossible to hide. They're claiming there's a whiskey glut, which is laughable when production this year is already down 55 million gallons compared to last year. If you're making dramatically less and still calling it a glut, something else is clearly going on. They're blaming shifts in youth drinking habits, as if millennials and Gen Z suddenly decided en masse to stop drinking bourbon in a few months. Kentucky newspapers, thankfully, aren't buying it. They're telling readers to ask Canada if they want the real story behind the state's signature industry. The shocking truth? The U.S. has lost 85% of its bourbon export market to Canada this year. 85%. This isn't a downturn. It isn't a minor correction. This is a full-blown market collapse. What makes it even worse for American producers is how markets really work. Bourbon used to be a reflex, a default in Canadian bars and restaurants. Bartenders reached for Jim Beam without even thinking. But once you break that habit, once people are forced to try alternatives, they often find they like them just as much, or even more. Reports from the Canadian restaurant industry show bartenders experimenting with Canadian whiskeys, Irish whiskeys, and other spirits they never would have considered before, and customers are responding, some even preferring the new options. And critically, Canadian consumers are paying attention to what's in their glass, and they're rejecting American bourbon on principle. Once that market share is lost, it doesn't automatically return when politics shift. Consumer habits are sticky, and once brand loyalty is broken, it's incredibly hard to rebuild. The ripple effects across the American bourbon industry have been staggering, and the Jim Beam shutdown is just the most visible symptom of a far deeper crisis. Jack Daniel's, another iconic American brand, announced layoffs back in August after a 65% drop in sales to Canada, and that was before the situation worsened. With the Canadian market now down 85%, you can only imagine the devastation inside their books. These are brands built over generations, synonymous with American culture and identity worldwide, and they're being systematically dismantled by a consumer movement that Donald Trump either didn't anticipate or, more likely, never even imagined could happen. In Trump's mind, countries and consumers were supposed to just accept whatever he demanded. The idea that ordinary people could exercise their own agency, make choices that could shake billion-dollar industries, apparently never crossed his mind. Take Kentucky Owl Bourbon, for example, which declared bankruptcy in October. Their story shows just how devastating the Canadian boycott has been. When the company tried to use their aging whiskey barrels as collateral to pay down debts, the courts rejected the proposal. Judge Everett, after hearing testimony from market experts, issued a statement that should alarm anyone in the industry. The testimony highlighted the dismal state of the barrel market and concluded that selling this inventory without steep discounts would be extremely difficult. Think about what that means. Barrels of aging bourbon, which should be increasing in value, have essentially become worthless. The entire economic model of the bourbon industry, built on aging whiskey as a long-term asset, has been upended because there's no market to sell to anymore. This is structural damage that could take years, even decades, to repair. What we're witnessing is a textbook example of how trade wars actually work, and it exposes just how flawed Trump's understanding of international commerce really is. He approaches trade like a real estate deal, make threats, demand concessions, and assume the other side will cave because they need you more than you need them. But modern economies don't work that way. International trade isn't just goods crossing borders. It's relationships, trust, and long-term consumer behavior. Trade isn't just about goods. It's about relationships, trust, and the expectation that agreements will be honored and partners treated with respect. When you violate those expectations, when you treat your trading partners with contempt, there are consequences. And those consequences don't always come in the form of formal tariffs or negotiable trade barriers. Sometimes, as we're seeing with Canada, they come from millions of individual consumers making choices that collectively devastate entire industries. From an economic perspective, the Canadian boycott is fascinating because it shows the power of coordinated consumer action in a way we rarely see. Economists call this consumer sovereignty, the idea that ultimately consumers drive market outcomes through their purchasing decisions. In practice, individual consumer choices often feel insignificant. What difference does it make if I choose one brand over another? The impact seems negligible, but when millions of consumers make the same choice at the same time, when there's a collective shift driven by shared values or grievances, the impact can be enormous. That's exactly what the Canadian boycott represents, and it's proving far more powerful than any formal trade barrier. You can negotiate tariffs, rewrite trade agreements, or compromise on policies, but you can't force consumers to buy products they've decided to reject on principle. The Republican Party's silence during this crisis has been deafening and telling. Mitch McConnell, whose home state of Kentucky is being hammered by this boycott, has said almost nothing. Republican senators from states with major bourbon and wine industries have been similarly absent. Why? Because standing up to Trump has become politically unthinkable within the party. Even when his actions directly harm their own constituents, The normal checks and balances of democracy, representatives defending their voters, party leaders correcting failing policies, simply stop working. Loyalty to Trump now outweighs the economic well-being of ordinary workers and entire communities. And make no mistake, the broader economic implications of this are profound. The damage goes far beyond the bourbon industry, though that's where it's most visible. When a major industry in a state like Kentucky starts to collapse, the ripple effects hit the entire economy. The suppliers making barrels and bottles, the trucking companies transporting the product, the restaurants and bars serving it, even the tourism built around bourbon heritage. These sectors are all interconnected, and when one major piece fails, the whole ecosystem suffers. What makes this especially cruel from an economic justice perspective is that the people paying the price had nothing to do with causing it. Jim Beam workers didn't vote to threaten Canada. Union members facing layoffs didn't push for aggressive trade policies. They're caught in the crossfire of a conflict they didn't start and can't control. That's always how bad economic policy works. The elites who promote it, who gain politically from it, never pay the price. Trump won't miss a meal because bourbon sales are down. McConnell won't struggle to pay his mortgage. But the working families in Kentucky, the people who actually produce the bourbon that made their state famous worldwide, they're the ones left to suffer. This pattern repeats across American economic life. Policies are made by people insulated from their consequences. Trade wars are started by politicians with no experience in the affected industries. Tax cuts are crafted by the wealthy to benefit the wealthy. Regulations are stripped away at the behest of corporations, even when those rules protect workers and communities. And in every case, when things go wrong, ordinary Americans are the ones who pay the price. What makes the Canadian situation especially fascinating from a political economy perspective is how it exposes the limits of American economic power. For decades, the U.S. has assumed its economic dominance gives it unilateral leverage in trade. Because we're the biggest market, other countries need access to our consumers more than we need access to theirs. That's the logic behind Trump's entire approach to trade. But the Canadian boycott proves that logic has limits. Yes, Canada's economy is smaller than the United States. Yes, they rely heavily on trade with us. But they are not powerless. When you push people far enough, insult them, and threaten them repeatedly, they find ways to push back. In today's interconnected economy, where consumer choice matters, that pushback can be devastatingly effective. The comparison between the U.S. and Canadian economies right now is striking. Canada was supposed to collapse. That was the whole theory behind Trump's strategy. Apply enough pressure, make enough threats, and they would have no choice but to give in. Instead, the opposite happened. Canada stood its ground. Its people organized the largest consumer boycott in memory, found alternative markets and suppliers, and their economy is thriving, with 54,000 new jobs created just last month. 3 consecutive months of job growth, unemployment at a 16-month low. The banking sector is comparing current conditions to the tech boom of the late 90s. Canada didn't just survive Trump's economic war, they're winning it. Meanwhile, the American economy is showing growing signs of strain. The affordability crisis Trump dismisses as a hoax is painfully real for families trying to make ends meet. Workers in industries caught in his trade wars face layoffs and uncertainty. We're also seeing the early signs of a broader shift in how America's trading partners view their relationship with us. If Canada can resist U.S. economic pressure, what does that mean for negotiations with other countries, and what precedent is being set? In contrast, Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky is showing what real leadership looks like. Unlike Republicans who remain silent while their states suffer, Beshear has been willing to speak honestly, calling out Trump's falsehoods on the affordability crisis. Governor Beshear called it a slap in the face to the people of Kentucky. He acknowledged that he's listening to his constituents, that he understands their struggles, and he expressed what so many of us feel. Surprised but not shocked that Trump still doesn't get it. Trump has never understood that leadership carries responsibility, that words have consequences, and that attacking your allies causes real, lasting damage. The contrast between Beshear and McConnell tells you everything about the current state of American political leadership. One speaks the truth even when it's uncomfortable. The other watches his state suffer in silence rather than challenge the leader of his party. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. Trump shows no sign of learning from this debacle, still making demands, still threatening, still apparently convinced that bullying will force Canada to submit. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The Canadian boycott shows no signs of weakening. Consumer preferences that shifted over the past year are likely permanent. The market for American bourbon in Canada may never fully recover, and this is only the end of year one of this economic war. What will years 2 and 3 bring? The damage is cumulative. With every month the boycott continues, the long-term consequences for American industries caught in the crossfire grow more severe. This is how market share is permanently lost, how entire industries decline, not through sudden catastrophes, but through steady, irreversible erosion. And the symbolic importance of what's happening cannot be overstated. In any economic conflict, certain battles carry enormous meaning, and nothing is more symbolic than the collapse of the American bourbon industry. Bourbon represents America itself, our history, culture, and identity. For Canada to target it sends a message far beyond economics. We reject your threats. We will not be intimidated. The symbolism is powerful precisely because bourbon is so quintessentially American. Reflecting on this year, the fundamental absurdity is striking. Donald Trump started this war of his own accord. Nobody asked him to threaten Canada on Christmas Day. Nobody forced him to suggest Canada become the 51st state. He acted entirely on his own ego and profound misunderstanding of international relations. And now, American workers are paying the price. American businesses are paying the price. American communities are paying the price. The Canadian people have demonstrated something extraordinary through their collective action. They've shown that ordinary citizens making everyday choices about what to buy and what not to buy can wield enormous power. By deciding, individually and as a nation, not to reward a bully with their consumer dollars, they prove that economic influence doesn't flow only from the top down, from governments or corporations. It can also flow from the bottom up, from millions of people deliberately directing where their resources go. This is a profound lesson in how power works in modern economies. We're often told that as consumers, workers, or ordinary citizens, we're powerless against massive economic forces, that corporations are too big, governments are too captured by special interests, the system too rigged. And there's some truth to those concerns. But what the Canadian boycott proves is that collective action still matters. When enough people coordinate around shared goals and values, they can move markets, change outcomes, and hold powerful interests accountable in ways formal politics often cannot. The